Well, she's not disqualified. You've got a blue slip thing that's horrible. It's a horrible thing. It makes it impossible to appoint a judge or a U.S. attorney, and it's a shame. And the Republicans should be ashamed of themselves that they allow this to go on, because I can't appoint a U.S. attorney that's not a Democrat, because they put a block on it. So if you appoint in Virginia or in New Jersey or in California a U.S. attorney or a judge, I mean, a judge situation is ridiculous. The only people that you can get by are Democrats, because they will put a hold on it. If I put up George Washington and Abraham Lincoln to be U.S. attorney in New Jersey or to be U.S. attorney in Virginia, we have Democrat senators, they will not approve them. And this is a gentleman's agreement that's lasted for too long, and it doesn't make it, especially in light of what's going on today, it means you can't appoint a Republican U.S. attorney.
So you heard him there, barely coherent, voice dripping with that signature mix of grievance and bluster, and here we are once again watching Donald Trump perform his favorite routine, the one where he positions himself as the ultimate victim of an intractable system, rigged against him by forces he can never name clearly enough to make sense, but can always invoke powerfully enough to stoke rage among his followers. And what's particularly brazen about this performance is that it comes on the heels of Alina Habba's forced resignation from her position as acting U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, after federal courts ruled she was serving unlawfully. Yet somehow Trump has managed to transform this moment of judicial accountability into another episode of his persecution theater. The sheer audacity of standing there, claiming that Democrats wouldn't even approve George Washington or Abraham Lincoln if he nominated them, invoking the founders themselves as rhetorical shields while he attempts to dismantle the very constitutional safeguards they established. And you need to understand what's happening here, because this isn't just another Trump tantrum. This is a calculated assault on one of the last remaining structural checks on authoritarian executive power, and I'm about to take you deep into why this matters more than almost anything else happening right now in American politics. Democratic senators have blocked several of Trump's nominees, including Alina Habba for U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, using the blue slip process. And before we go any further, you need to understand what blue slips actually are, because this is where the constitutional architecture meets raw political power. The blue slip is a paper form the Senate Judiciary Committee has used for more than a century to give home state senators the courtesy to show their endorsement or disapproval for presidential nominations in their home state. Designed to encourage consultation between the White House and senators for lifetime appointments to the federal bench, as well as U.S. attorneys and marshals, which means this isn't some obscure procedural gotcha. This is a fundamental expression of the Senate's constitutional role in providing advice and consent on presidential appointments. And here's what's absolutely critical to understand about why this tradition exists, and why Trump's fury at it reveals everything about his authoritarian impulses. Without the blue slip, home state senators would have no input on who the president appoints to prosecute crimes as the lead federal prosecutor, or sit for lifetime appointments on the federal district court that oversees cases in their states, and it prevents one party from jamming through nominees who don't align with the values in the communities they would serve, ensuring home state senators retain a say on behalf of their constituents. So when Trump stands there whining about how he can't get his people confirmed, what he's really saying is that he's furious that the constitutional system of checks and balances still has any teeth whatsoever, that Democratic senators representing millions of constituents in states like New Jersey still have the power to say no when he tries to install his personal lawyer with virtually no prosecutorial experience into one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in the country. And this is where the scandal gets so much worse, because Alina Habba resigned after an appeals court ruled she was serving unlawfully, with judges rejecting the Justice Department's process as an effort by the Trump administration to usurp traditional appointment processes, noting that the maneuver of tapping a series of acting U.S. attorneys would allow a presidential appointee to serve without Senate confirmation indefinitely. Think about what that means for a moment, because it's genuinely chilling when you sit with it. Trump wasn't just trying to work around the blue slip process through normal political pressure. He engaged in what judges called Byzantine maneuvers that violated the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, attempting to install Habba through a multi-step process designed to circumvent Senate confirmation requirements entirely. And when the courts finally said enough is enough, you cannot simply ignore the law, his response was to throw this public tantrum about how the system is rigged against him. And here's where we need to zoom out and see the forest for the trees. Because what Trump is doing here fits perfectly into the broader authoritarian playbook that scholars have been documenting with increasing alarm throughout this second administration. Every totalitarian relies on the justice system to punish dissent, but also to immunize illegality for loyalists, where if you speak out against the government, the legal system comes crashing down on you. But if you're loyal, you can get away with crimes. And we are seeing this at scale right now, with the indictment of James Comey for no crime where not a single prosecutor in the Virginia office would sign the indictment until Trump sent his personal lawyer to take over that office. This is the context that makes Trump's blue slip grievances so much more sinister, because what he wants, what he is literally demanding, is the unfettered ability to install loyalists who will prosecute his enemies and protect his allies, transforming the Department of Justice from an independent institution dedicated to the rule of law into his personal legal army. And legal experts note that in this situation, you have a president who is openly brazenly bragging about his ability to seek retribution against his political enemies, and it looks as if the Trump White House is insisting career prosecutors use their power to make life hell for people who challenge Trump, and on the other side of the coin to drop investigations or pardon people who support the president. Let me break down exactly what has been happening with these appointments, because the details are genuinely shocking when you line them up, and Democrats Cory Booker and Andy Kim, the Garden State senators, used the blue slip privilege to block Alina Habba from ever becoming New Jersey's U.S. attorney, and this is after Habba, Trump's former personal lawyer, was nominated for U.S. attorney in New Jersey, someone whose legal experience consisted primarily of losing cases on Trump's behalf and making inflammatory statements on cable news. The sheer audacity of trying to install your personal attorney, someone with clear conflicts of interest and minimal relevant experience, as the top federal prosecutor in a major state, and then claiming victimhood when the constitutional process prevents you from doing so, is breathtaking in its cynicism. But Trump wasn't content to accept this defeat, so Trump appointed Habba through legally dubious means since she was never confirmed by the Senate, and after a protracted legal fight about whether she could serve without Senate confirmation, a federal judge ruled she was serving without lawful authority, and a federal appeals court unanimously upheld that decision. Now watch what happens next, because this is where it gets truly Orwellian in its implications. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the court's ruling has made it untenable for Habba to effectively run her office with politicized judges pausing trials designed to bring violent criminals to justice, claiming these judges should not be able to countermand the president's choice of attorneys entrusted with carrying out the executive branch's core responsibility of prosecuting crime. Do you see what they're doing here? Federal judges following the law and enforcing constitutional requirements for Senate confirmation are now being characterized as politicized actors who are somehow enabling violent crime by insisting that the president follow proper appointment procedures. This is the language of autocracy. The rhetoric that says any institutional check on executive power is itself a form of corruption, that loyalty to the leader supersedes fidelity to law and constitutional process, and it should terrify anyone who understands even the most basic principles of democratic governance. And Habba is just one example, because the Trump administration installed temporary U.S. attorneys in Virginia, Nevada, and California, using similar mechanisms, with judges ruling that all these appointments, including Lindsay Halligan in Virginia, were unlawful, and Halligan had secured indictments against Trump's political foes, former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, while serving as top federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of Virginia, before a judge ordered the cases dismissed after concluding Halligan was unlawfully appointed. Think about the implications here, because they are staggering. Trump is using illegal appointment processes to install personal loyalists with no prosecutorial experience into positions of immense power, and those loyalists are then immediately using that illegally obtained power to indict Trump's political enemies on charges that career prosecutors refused to bring because there was no evidence of crimes. Not a single prosecutor in that office in Virginia would sign the indictment, not a single one, until President Trump sent his personal lawyer to take over that office because only she would sign the indictment. This is not normal political hardball. This is not even aggressive norm-breaking. This is the systematic dismantling of the rule of law in favor of what scholars of authoritarianism call competitive authoritarianism, where a leader comes to power democratically and then erodes the system of checks and balances, typically filling the civil service and key appointments, including the prosecutor's office and judiciary, with loyalists, then attacking the media, universities, and non-governmental organizations to blunt public criticism and tilt the electoral playing field in the ruling party's favor. And when you look at Trump's rage about blue slips in this broader context, it becomes crystal clear what he's actually demanding. He wants the final structural impediment to his complete capture of the federal prosecutorial apparatus removed, so that he can staff U.S. attorney offices across the country with loyalists who will pursue his enemies and protect his allies without any meaningful oversight or accountability. Now let's talk about the historical and constitutional significance of what Trump is trying to destroy here, because this matters immensely, and the blue slip process has been central to how the Senate performs its constitutional duty of confirming presidential nominees, representing a tradition in place since at least 1918 according to the Congressional Research Service. This isn't some recent Democratic invention designed to thwart Trump specifically. This is a century-old practice rooted in the Constitution's requirement that the president make appointments by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. And Article 2 of the Constitution creates a shared authority between the Senate and the president to make treaties and appoint federal officials, with the blue slip functioning as a mechanism to implement the Senate's constitutional obligation to offer advice and consent. Trump is essentially arguing that this constitutional role should be abolished whenever it inconveniences him, that the Senate's advice and consent should mean nothing more than rubber stamping whatever loyalists he chooses to appoint, regardless of their qualifications or the concerns of senators representing the states where these officials would wield enormous power. And here's where the Republican hypocrisy becomes so nauseating, because Senate Republicans have been unbowed arguing they used the blue slip process to their own benefit when Democrat Joe Biden was president, saying they will want the practice in place if they are in the minority again, with Republicans noting judges who don't receive approval from home state senators are unlikely to have enough votes for confirmation anyway, and Chuck Grassley posted that in the Biden administration, Republicans kept 30 liberals off the bench that President Trump can now fill with conservatives. So when they controlled the Senate under Biden, they were perfectly happy to use blue slips to block Democratic nominees, but now that Democrats are using the exact same process to block unqualified Trump loyalists, suddenly it's an intolerable outrage that must be eliminated. This isn't principle. This is pure power politics dressed up in the language of constitutional grievance. Senator Shelley Moore Capito said she supports Senator Grassley and his support of the blue slip, and would like to see preservation of it, representing a rare instance of daylight between Trump and Senate Republicans, which tells you that even some Republicans understand that destroying this check on executive power would be catastrophic not just for democracy, but for their own institutional prerogatives. But Trump doesn't care about institutional prerogatives or constitutional balance, because he has weaponized the Justice Department like nobody in history, with legal scholars warning this represents a fundamental break from decades of precedent meant to insulate the Justice Department from political interference. And inside the Justice Department, attorneys are resigning in protest. And Attorney General Pam Bondi at her confirmation hearing vowed to fight violent crime and restore confidence and integrity to the Justice Department, promising the partisanship and weaponization would be gone, and America would have one tier of justice for all. But critics point to the corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams, where department leadership directed prosecutors to dismiss the case, suggesting it interfered in the mayor's ability to help Trump with immigration enforcement, with nearly a dozen prosecutors resigning in protest. This is what Trump's vision of one tier of justice actually looks like in practice. Loyalty to Trump means your crimes are forgiven. Opposition to Trump means you face prosecution even when career prosecutors say there's no evidence of criminal conduct. Now let's really sit with the George Washington and Abraham Lincoln reference, because it's so revealing of Trump's rhetorical strategy and his fundamental contempt for his audience's intelligence, standing there claiming that Democrats would block even the founders themselves if Trump nominated them, as if the objection to Alina Habba or Lindsey Halligan had anything to do with their party affiliation, rather than their manifest unsuitability for the positions and their troubling conflicts of interest. This is classic authoritarian discourse, reducing complex questions of qualifications, experience, and institutional independence to simple tribal loyalty, painting any institutional resistance as partisan obstruction rather than legitimate constitutional checking of executive overreach. And the tragedy is that it works, that millions of Americans watching this clip will genuinely believe that Trump is the victim of partisan witch hunts rather than a would-be autocrat, systematically destroying the guardrails of democratic governance because he has successfully cultivated a narrative ecosystem where any check on his power is automatically reframed as corrupt partisan interference. And we need to examine what life actually looks like under the system Trump is trying to create, because the idea that the White House should not interfere with the DOJ is a widely accepted constitutional norm, and since Nixon, major reforms such as contact policies requiring all communications between the White House and DOJ about specific cases to be well documented have become deeply rooted in the public's understanding of just and transparent federal government, representing one of the most important institutional reforms to emerge from the Watergate crisis. In 1973, the nation's capital was embroiled with scandal regarding President Richard Nixon's corruption schemes, as Nixon famously kept an enemies list, directed wiretapping of political enemies, and orchestrated break-ins to multiple enemies' offices looking for incriminating evidence, and Nixon resigned in shame before Congress could officially impeach him. But during the presidency of Richard Nixon, public servants at the DOJ felt squeezed between what the president wanted and what the law required. But even Nixon was not as clear and open as Trump is now about what he wanted to happen. Trump has gone beyond Nixon. He has dispensed with even the pretense of respecting DOJ independence, and on March 14, 2025, Trump declared himself the chief law enforcement officer in the country, a title traditionally used to refer to the Attorney General. The pattern is unmistakable and terrifying. We aren't on the verge of an authoritarian takeover, we are in the middle of it, and while it's not a fait accompli and not certain to be successful if we aren't clear-eyed about what is happening, then we have no chance to arrest it, and a survey of more than 500 political scientists finds that the vast majority think the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward some form of authoritarianism, with scholars who focus on democracy and authoritarianism deeply troubled by Trump's attempts to expand executive power, with Stephen Levitsky of Harvard saying we've slid into some form of authoritarianism that is relatively mild compared to some others, and certainly reversible, but we are no longer living in a liberal democracy. These aren't partisan hacks or alarmist activists. These are serious scholars who study democratic breakdown for a living, who have spent their careers analyzing how democracies die in Hungary and Venezuela and Turkey, and they are telling us with increasing urgency that the same patterns are visible here. And when you watch Trump in that clip ranting about blue slips and Democrats and the horrible system that won't let him appoint whoever he wants, you need to understand that Trump and Democrats have shown little interest in working with each other, despite the practice traditionally meaning previous presidents often worked with home state senators to make appointments, because Trump doesn't want consultation or collaboration, he wants submission. Trump has focused his ire on Chuck Grassley, a longtime ally who is the senior-most Senate Republican, calling on Grassley to have the courage to stop honoring blue slips, and posting that Grassley, whom Trump got re-elected to the U.S. Senate when he was down by a lot in Iowa, could solve the blue slip problem. Even his own party's Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, a stalwart conservative who has been more than accommodating to Trump's agenda, is now being publicly attacked and pressured because he won't completely abandon a century-old constitutional tradition that serves as one of the last meaningful checks on executive power over federal law enforcement. What Trump is demanding, what he has been demanding since the moment he descended that golden escalator, and throughout both his administrations, is the complete and total submission of every institution to his personal will, the transformation of the Department of Justice from an independent agency devoted to the rule of law into his personal legal hit squad, and the blue slip is standing in his way, because it represents one of the few remaining mechanisms through which senators can exercise meaningful oversight over federal prosecutors in their states. Despite Republicans holding the majority in the Senate, the blue slip tradition is currently derailing President Trump's efforts to place some of his most high-profile nominees into key roles in blue states, and having prosecutorial power in states run by Democrats, particularly those of the most corrupt kinds, gives the president an important check on the left's agenda, which accidentally reveals exactly what's at stake here. Trump wants loyalist prosecutors in blue states not to pursue justice impartially, but to serve as a check on democratic governance, to weaponize federal law enforcement against elected officials and policies he opposes. And here's the absolutely critical point that should be seared into everyone's consciousness. Removing barriers between the DOJ and the White House could allow the president to exert more control over individual prosecutors and investigators as they evaluate cases and choose whom to prosecute, with the president having campaigned on the promise of investigating and prosecuting those he perceived to be his rivals, and political appointees like the Attorney General could be removed if they refuse to pursue politically motivated investigations, undermining trust in the justice system's impartiality. This isn't speculation about what Trump might do, this is documentation of what he has already done and what he has explicitly promised to do more of. On September 24, 2025, Trump posted multiple messages on Truth Social, encouraging and directing Pam Bondi to prosecute his political opponents, specifically calling out Senator Adam Schiff, former FBI Director James Comey, and New York Attorney General Letitia James, stating the lack of prosecutions was killing our reputation and credibility, with the majority of posts criticizing a Justice Department official who reportedly stated there was not enough evidence to launch a prosecution against Letitia James. So when Trump stands there complaining about blue slips and invoking George Washington, What he's actually revealing is his fury that constitutional checks on executive power still function at all, that Democratic senators can still say no when he tries to install manifestly unqualified loyalists into positions where they could pursue his political enemies, and that federal judges still have the power to rule that his Byzantine appointment schemes violate federal law. This is the authoritarian's eternal complaint. Why must these stupid rules and norms and laws get in the way of what I want to do? Why can't I simply exercise power as I see fit? Why won't everyone just submit to my will and accept that my judgment supersedes constitutional process and institutional independence? And the tragedy, the genuine historical tragedy that we are living through, is that tens of millions of Americans have been conditioned through years of right-wing media ecosystem propaganda to hear Trump's authoritarian demands and interpret them as righteous resistance to partisan obstruction rather than as the systematic dismantling of democratic governance. We are watching in real time as Trump attempts to complete the authoritarian playbook, and what we are witnessing is not a descent into chaos, but a controlled assertion of hierarchy with one-party rule, courts demoted to advisory status, and the instruments of justice and security repurposed for political preservation. And if we allow him to destroy the blue slip process and install loyalists in U.S. attorney offices across the country without Senate oversight, then our finding is that the American people are well along the path to living in an authoritarian country, with analysts looking at indicators we would see overseas when an autocrat rises and begins to take power. Finding those indicators are happening here, as President Trump and his cronies are doing just what dictators usually do using their playbook. This is the moment. This is the fight. And every single person who cares about democracy and the rule of law and constitutional governance needs to understand that Trump's tantrum about blue slips isn't a sideshow or a distraction. It's the main event. It's the battle over whether we will preserve any meaningful checks on authoritarian executive power, or whether we will sleepwalk into autocracy while telling ourselves that American exceptionalism will somehow save us from the fate that has befallen every other democracy that failed to defend its institutions when they came under assault.